Hi, I'm Rob. It's garage time. Hi everybody, and welcome to the garage. Welcome to my machines. As you can see by my attire, it's another chilly day up here in the springtime Northeast. And in fact, it has just begun sprinkling just outside, just behind the camera. As I'm sitting here in the XJ6 passenger seat, doing my usual horrible extemporaneous narration. Today, in this episode, we're gonna step away from the Jag Special build a little bit because I've been doing this channel for a year, and after the last episode, after episode 17 part 2, I had a couple of interactions with viewers who'd asked some questions about a couple of things, and I thought that I would take this opportunity to answer them. The first question is from Robb Parker on the Unfinished and Complete Kit Cars, Hand-Built Cars, Replicas, and Dune Buggies Facebook page, where he asked about my front shock installation, specifically the mounting of the lower end. And while I did reply to him in that thread, I thought that I would take this opportunity to go over that in a bit more detail to show you, to show my viewership and specifically Mr. Parker, exactly what is going on down there in the at the bottom end of the front shocks, so that you get a clear idea of what I did and how I designed it. And then the other thing that I want to do is I have recently gone back to posting a little bit on the lowcostusa.com forums, which is where the three-wheeler build log was chronicled over the course of that build. Unfortunately, there was a huge server crash on that website. I want to say around about 2015 or 2016, something like that. And all the pictures that I had posted over 3 years of the build were lost. And so I kind of stopped going. Plus, a whole lot of pictures that were there for the beginning of this build were also lost. And I haven't really posted there in a while. And so I thought I would post there mostly to promote this channel. But then I got a question from one of the guys I used to interact with kind of frequently on the Low Cost USA forums. And he was asking me, what, no video of the three-wheeler? So I thought that I would take this opportunity to maybe do a little bit of exposition on it. So to begin with, let's talk about the Jag Special lower shock mounts. Okay, so here we are down here at the passenger side front of the Jag Special, and right here we have the QA1 coilover with its entirely too heavy 450-pound-inch spring, the Jaguar upper control arm with the bump stops ground off and the bolt holes welded in, and down here we have the stock XJ6 control arm without its bolted on center plate that would otherwise mount the stock coil spring from the control arm bottom plate to the spring mount up in the stock XJ6 chassis. Here's a picture so you can see what that looks like. You can also see that the shock absorber mount goes to a stamping right here at the outermost corner of the control arm and is attached to the control arm with two 5/16 24 bolts at the back that go from the shock mount through the anti-roll bar or sway bar attachment link, through the mounting boss on the control arm and poking out the bottom. The inside is fastened by the simple expedient of bolting through the ball joint at the forward end of the shock mount. So the standard shock mount is a steel stamping, and what I've created here is a weldment. Let's get in a little closer without blurring it too much. What I created was a weldment with a 1/8 inch bottom plate and then a piece of 1.5 by, I believe this was 1.5 by 3 inch tubing because that's what I have, that mounts the bottom of the shock in the same position as the stock shock mount. The difference being, I don't know if you can see right here, there's a small 1/8 inch spacer in between the bottom plate and the sway bar link mount. And that is because this mounting point on the stock shock mount is lower than the mount that goes to the ball joint attachment. And so what I had to do was put some spacers under there so I could use this flat plate. This little notch that you see right here is for clearance at full lock right there on the spindle. So that's the basic description. Let's now take a look at the build notebook. I'm pretty sure I have a drawing in there. I think I do. Maybe I even have some rusty old parts to look at. We'll see. Okay, we step away from the handheld exposition. And here we have, I went through my bucket of leftover Jaguar donor parts. And here we have the original lower shock mount from the XJ6 front suspension. And as you can see, it's a simple, I shouldn't say a simple stamping, but it's a one piece of steel that is just put into a machine and clobbered into shape, and then has some holes drilled in it. But it's open at the bottom, which makes it significantly weaker than a weldment made with this rectangular tubing welded to a piece of 1/8 inch plate. Here we have the bottom forward shock bracket, which I built in March 12th of 2021. Here is the outline of the bottom plate, and you'll see that it's not really dimensioned. And in order to make this right here, I took the bracket and I set it down on top of a piece of 3 inch wide, 1/8 inch thick steel strap, and I traced it out. And so I made this shape. And then what I did was I took and I just marked these holes and drilled them out. And then I measured the center from here to here. Comes out to be 0.77. And that's the measurement I used to place this bracket once I had it shaped. Once I'd welded it, I had to get out an end mill and do a radius on the inside of this corner on the bracket, so that the washer for the bolt and the bolt head would sit flat on the plate. And feel free to take a screenshot of this page if you want to design a bracket like this, and then make sure you save your stock bracket so you can trace out the bottom part. And you can measure the holes, or you can do just like I did and just use the bracket as a template on the bottom plate and then just drill the holes. So that's that. Okay, so that is the exposition on the bottom forward shock mount brackets for the Jag Special. Now, let's talk about this thing. The story of the three-wheeler actually begins in 2004. I had to sell the motorcycle I had at the time, which was a 1991 Suzuki Intruder 1400. Cool bike, had a lot of fun with it, rode it from 2001 until 2004, and then I sold it. And for the first time in my adult life, I was without a motorcycle. Having started riding motorcycles in 1975 and then having had a motorcycle all the way through until then. And so my brother, Randy, gave me a motorcycle that he had. It was a 1980 Yamaha XS850 that I spent a couple of months going through, overhauling, making it run. I swapped a set of Mikuni carburetors on in place of the Hitachis that were stock on the bike. Because Mikunis are tunable and Hitachis, I mean, you can't really get parts for. You can, but you can't. So I put on a set of Mikuni BS34s from that I got out of the boneyard from a late 70s XS750, the precursor to the 850, and then got it running and rode that until 2006 when the ignition coils croaked. So I parked the bike and it lived underneath a steadily deteriorating motorcycle cover and then a tarp for the next 3 years. For the majority of my life, back from when I was a boy building model cars and building slot cars and racing them, always had a penchant for hot rods, and I'd always wanted to build a T-bucket. But I'm also really enamored of British sports cars, and and beyond that, I'm enamored of like sports cars from the classic period, from like the interwar period, the 1920s and 1930s. And so what I wound up doing completely by happenstance was I was online and looking at old car pictures, and I saw a picture of a BMW Dixie, which was BMW's version of the Austin 7. And I was like, oh, that's really simple. But then that picture led me to pictures of the Morgan Super Sports of the early 1930s, from like 1932 to 1936. And I was looking at that, and I looked at a picture of a naked chassis of the Morgan Super Sport, and I thought, the three-wheeler Morgan, and I thought to myself, that looks pretty easy. How hard could it be? And in 2010, that's where the project began. Oh, well, the first thing I did was I got the XS850 running again after it had been sitting outside in the driveway for 3 years. It wasn't too difficult. One of the tricks that I did was I replaced the stock Yamaha ignition coils, which when I went to get it running, I found had completely died. They just didn't work anymore. There was no spark. And so what I did was I went to the boneyard and I scrounged some automotive ignition coils out of Suzuki Samurai's coil. I got like 6 of them for $5. And I brought them home and I wired them into the bike. And lo and behold, that thing it fired the hottest blue spark that it ever had in its entire life since its manufacture. That fixed the ignition problem. And so, I had seen the picture of the Morgan three-wheel and I thought, well, how hard could that be? I'll build one of those. So that's the origin. That's where the origin came from. Now let's go over to the three-wheeler and take a look at it, and I'll show you some of the details. Alrighty then. Let's talk about the three-wheeler. Sometimes known as the B-3 because it's got 3 wheels, 1, 2, 3, and some MGB parts in the front end. Also, the term B-3 calls back to my rock musician career. In the early days, the hot keyboard setup to have was a Hammond B-3 with a Leslie. It's constructed a lot like a low-cost 7 scratch build. The chassis is all made of 1-inch square 16-gauge tubing. The body takes its shape from the shape of the chassis. The skin is aircraft grade 3003 H13, I think, 35 thousandths thick. As you can see, it's unpainted on the sides, but the cowl is painted. The tail cover is some red marine vinyl. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. It's got separate brakes for the front and the rear. Here's the shifter, here's the rear brake. The engine is the aforementioned Yamaha XS850 with its rack of Mikuni BS34s. These are, in fact, the Suzuki car coils that I got out of Henry's Used Auto Parts in Blackstone, not Whitensville. That day in 2010, or I forget when it was. It was a long time ago. Yeah, 2010. As it sits right now, it weighs about maybe 925 pounds. I've weighed it like 4 or 5 times. That's things in general. Let me grab an individual camera and we can go around it and talk about some things in detail. All right. By individual camera, what I actually meant was handheld. Here's my hand. I'm holding it. Let's start with the front wheels and the front suspension in general. These front wheels are MGB items. Now, these aren't the first set of wheels that I've had on this. The original wheels, which I did source from the Boneyard on my birthday, November 3rd of 2010, it looked a little bit like this. So again, the reason I swapped to these MWS reproductions of the Dunlop wheels is because you can use these wire wheels with tubeless tires and you don't have to put a tube in them, which makes putting tires on the wheels a whole lot easier, trust me. When I originally scrounged these wheels from the Boneyard, they had what are called safety nuts on the wheels. I still have those, but I wanted the 2-ear knockoffs, so these knockoffs were items that I got off eBay for 20 bucks for a set of 4. Yeah, I thought that was pretty sweet. They look cool going down the road. Oh yeah. The front tire is a smaller diameter tire than is ordinarily had on an MGB. These are 155/65 14s, I believe, that I got specifically so they would fit inside the cycle fenders. As I mentioned, as I crawl myself down onto the ground here, the front wheel, the brake rotor, the brake caliper, which you can maybe see back there, and the spindle are all MGB parts. The MGB spindle is quite literally carried over 1930s technology. It's, instead of using ball joints, as you can see, there's no ball joint here, and there's no ball joint here. Rather, there is a bushed trunnion at the top, and then another bushed trunnion, a little hard to see, I don't know, get the camera in there. There's another bushed trunnion at the bottom. In between those two trunnions is a kingpin, and then the body of the spindle rotates on that kingpin in 2 bronze bushings. You can see there's a greasy grease fitting there. There's another grease fitting down here. There are like 3 different grease fittings on the spindle. As you may well imagine, it's a kind of pain in the ass to maintain. But they work. And why MG never changed the front spindles to ball joints, who knows? This type of spindle, this what MGB refers to as a kingpin swivel, was first seen on the MGTD and then carried right through from the TD to the TF to the MGA to the MGB. And now it's on the 3-wheeler. So these shocks, the front shocks, are motorcycle items These are progressive suspension 412s, I believe, that were originally intended to go on the back of a Suzuki Intruder M109 Cruiser. The front springs are pretty stiff. They're 315 inch-pounds. So yeah, the front of this thing is sprung pretty stiffly, which is great because it handles really nicely. It's very immediate. The control arms I made myself. This is 1-inch 120 wall tubing with some 1/8-inch flat plate. This is 3/16 plate right here. These are 1/2-inch spherical rod ends with the pivots have Teflon bearings in them, and they've got 22,000 miles on them, and they're not having a problem. The upper control arm is 3/4 inch by 120 wall tubing. Although these guys here are 3/4 inch 156 wall, and then it was bored out so that I could cut some 1/2-20 threads in it to put the spherical rod ends in. These are, of course, the fender struts that I created using that bent welding rod method that you saw me fail with when I was creating the angled side tubes for the transmission tunnel in the Jag Special. It worked pretty mint for those. All right, so now the fenders. I didn't form these fenders. I didn't bend them, and I didn't form that inside flange. These fenders were made from some vacuum sealed cans. And I thought those will make perfect fenders. And I cut it in half and sectioned it and measured and made the radius and turned them into fenders, and they work perfectly, and of course they look great too. The steering rack, you can see the input down in there. The steering rack is from a Porsche 924. It's a manual rack from I want to say like a 78 or 79 Porsche 924. This coupling link right here is the coupling link, the steering link from a Porsche 944. Two cars that were sitting side by side at Henry's in Blackstone when I scrounged those parts. Surprisingly, I mean, these are the standard MGB steering arms. And they use the same taper in the attachment hole that the Porsche tie rod ends use. So all I had to do was shorten these by 1 inch and then drop the Porsche tie rod end into the steering arm. And I had to add a thicker washer on the bottom side because the Porsche bolt's a little bit longer, because the Porsche steering arm is a little bit thicker at its attachment. But works fine. The only complaint I have about using that 924 steering rack is that with the MGB steering arms, it's a little bit slow. So like if I do a power slide, I have to be really careful because I can easily get behind in my steering and spin the thing around or curb the tire or do some other stupid thing. So I have to be careful. This right here is a plain old $30 Grant Industries steering wheel that I got at AutoZone. It is connected to the upper steering column using a Speedway Motors quick disconnect with a bit of yellow paint on there so that I can align it so that it's mostly straight when you're going forward. To connect the Grant steering wheel to the Porsche parts is a series of Volkswagen, like mid-90s Volkswagen Jetta steering column and Speedway Motors parts. This D section tubing and the spline end and this coupling are all Volkswagen Jetta. The bearings are Speedway Motors. This little clamp here is Speedway Motors. And then there were two more bearings in this area here that are holding the upper piece of the steering column. Here's what it looks like under the cowling and where the other pieces of the steering column are. Now, you would be correct in assuming that that is a Mercedes-Benz grille. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So while we're still at the front end, let's talk about the engine. As mentioned before, this is a 1980 Yamaha XS850 with its integral sequential motorcycle 5-speed transmission, shifted by this nifty Hurst lever from a Hurst 3-speed unit that was gifted to me by a friend, connected to the shift rod, the reversed and shortened shift arm on the transmission by this handmade linkage. The shifter pushes the rod, operates this bell crank. It's transferred through that tube, which rides on another custom length rod on 2 bronze bushings. There's the inner bell crank and the linkage that goes down to the shifter. It has worked mint for 23,000 miles. This engine originally is in 826, the stock displacement is 826 cc. I bored it out to 896 cc. Did it increase the performance? I don't know. It did a burnout at the original displacement. It does a burnout now. As I mentioned before, yeah, these are those Mikuni BS34s that I got out of Jack's up in Woburn, that have been cleaned. They were cleaned up and rejetted, and they work great. I don't have a problem. It starts up and runs, carburetes nicely. It's jetted, kind of rich, and you can see in some places where there are little tiny bits, like right here on the exhaust, there's a teeny tiny leak, and you can see a little bit of carbon that, from the exhaust, because it's jetted pretty fat. Here, right on the firewall, is the fuel pressure regulator set to 1 psi to mimic the 1 psi that would be coming out of a fuel tank on the motorcycle. Comes in the tank from this hard line from the tank, and then goes through this. This is the fuel shutoff on the firewall. Then there's this handmade T, because on the XS850 the tank sits so low over the frame that there were 2 fuel valves, one on each side of the tank. So the rack of carburetors has 2 fuel inlets. So I just set it up this way so it would have the same 2 fuel inlets. The fuel system is fed by this 6.5 gallon, move the seatbelt, by this 6.5 gallon Speedway Motors polypropylene fuel tank. And it is fed from the tank fuel outlet right there, comes down the hose into the filter, and then it goes into a Mr. Gasket electric fuel pump, regular old fuel pump you would put on any carbureted car. It's like 4 to 5 psi, which is why I have the adjustable fuel pressure regulator on it. This vehicle is very much like an old British sports car. It, if you can see down in there, it leaks oil, just like any self-respecting old British sports car would. So, as I mentioned, the front of this thing has
has MGB rotors and MGB calipers, also sourced from the boneyard that I rebuilt myself. The front brakes are worked with this Willwood 3/4 inch single master cylinder. Underneath by this Volkswagen Jetta brake pedal. Here's the throttle, which is handmade. We know that the front brakes are operated by a pedal. This is the rear brake right here. This right here is it's a master cylinder from I want to say a Kawasaki Vulcan that has a handmade inline outlet to again, a Speedway Motors pressure switch to activate the taillight. Here's the line from the master cylinder, from the master cylinder reservoir. Line goes under there, a hose comes up, and there's the master cylinder right there. There's the reservoir right there. So you press the lever to activate the brake as opposed to pulling it. This is the stock Suzuki Intruder 1400 rotor, but this caliper right here is from a Suzuki LC 1500/C90, and it mounts to the stock Intruder 1400 rear brake bracket pretty okay, but I had to create this extension bracket right here to tilt the stock Suzuki bracket back far enough to get the LC 1500 caliper to sit in a place where it wasn't interfering with either the shock or the swing arm. This right here is the swing arm from a 1993 Suzuki Intruder 1400 with, again, these are aftermarket shock absorbers. These are, I think, these are progressive suspension 110s maybe, I think. Again, shocks that I got off eBay. I've got, of course, an automotive tire on the Intruder 1400 rim. It's a bit of a struggle getting it on there. Motorcycle rims are just slightly bigger in diameter for a given tire size. This tire right here is a 185 70/15 or 185 60/15, I think. And the rear tire on a Suzuki Intruder 1400 is a 180 90/15. And the car tire takes quite literally about 100 psi to mount on this. Because of that tiny little difference in diameter. This business right here, as you can see, this right here is the rear section of an Intruder 1400 frame, also in 1993, that I got from a guy in Illinois. I sectioned it and made it as flat a plane as I could so that I could weld it to the back of the structure that I built. And then it's pretty heavily triangulated, and it's got other structure around it to make it stronger. As you can see, there's a boxed attachment right here. Like I said, there's triangulating tubes right here. This right here, this piece of angle steel with the holes in it, is actually the mount for the fuel tank. They're the bolts that mount the fuel tank straps. This is, in fact, a Suzuki Intruder 1400 rear swing arm, but this right here, this final drive, is a Suzuki Intruder 800 final drive. And the reason I've got that on there is for the shorter gearing. The shorter gearing makes it accelerate a little better, and it makes it much easier to get away from stops. I've actually tried it with a Suzuki Intruder 1400 rear end on there, and it's great on the highway, keeps the revs lower, but it's like taking off in second gear every time, and that only wears the clutch out faster. The clutch is weak. This as I said, this thing weighs around 925 pounds, which is about 400 pounds heavier than the original motorcycle. So the clutch starts to slip after about 2 seasons. The last time I refreshed the clutch was in 2019. And at the end of last season, I was feeling it slipping a little bit. And once again, I don't baby the thing. I do the occasional burnout, and I like to hammer it through the gears. And so the clutch starts to slip after a while, and it has recently begun doing that again. So I have a fresh set of Barnett clutch plates to install, and you'll get to see that at some point, probably sooner rather than later. Here is the clutch pedal, which is actually the hand clutch from the XS850 with the ball end sectioned and flattened so that I could add this plate to make a pedal. It's on the firewall on a bracket made from angle steel and a piece of 19mm round tubing that came from the XS850 chassis. The engine is connected to the rear swing arm with a 2-piece custom-made drive shaft. I'll put this thing up on some jacks so that we can take a look, and I'll show you what the drive shaft looks like installed in the thing. Howdy. Welcome to the underworld, or the bottom of the three-wheeler anyway. We are looking up into the drive shaft tunnel, and let's take a look at some details of the drive shaft. Get my arm up in there so I can point a little better. Here is the output from the XS850 engine. Right here is the universal joint from the XS850, and right here is the spline end from the drive shaft that would otherwise be inside the XS850 swing arm that I cut off and had machined so that it would be a tight slip fit inside this tube. This tube right here is a piece of 1-inch diameter DOM, which means drawn over mandrel, tubing that has a 0.156 wall, which is, I forget what. I call this the intermediate drive shaft because it goes from the engine along underneath to the secondary drive shaft right here, which goes underneath the driver's seat, right up there, about an inch away from this secondary drive shaft is the driver's seat, above this aluminum cover. Right here, what we have is a Suzuki Intruder 800 universal joint with a Suzuki Intruder 800 spline end welded to the end of the tube. And then we have another Suzuki Intruder, although this might be a 1400 spline end. The Suzuki Intruder 800 and the Suzuki Intruder 1400 use the same spline ends. This is from the engine. This is from the output on the engine. This is one of the spline ends from a drive shaft in the swing arm of a Suzuki, and they use the same universal joint. So here's our drive shaft, intermediate drive shaft tube. Here's the Suzuki Intruder universal joint with the Suzuki Intruder spline ends right there. So this is supported in 2 race cart axle bearings for a 1-inch axle. Here's one at the back. Here's the other one at the front. As you can see, they're on 3-bolt bearing holders. The reason that this section of drive shaft is supported is because the drive shaft is not supported inside the swing arm, and rather when it's in its stock application in the motorcycle, it just plugs right onto the output shaft of the engine, and it's supported there. So in order for this to work, I had to support this second piece of drive shaft, and so we've got the 2 bearings, and it works pretty mint. And this is the same material as the intermediate drive shaft. It's 1 inch 156 wall. Going out, boys. The interior. The dashboard is a piece of 1/2 inch birch plywood that I stained and urethaned. The glove box, which of course is full of junk, is just more of that same plywood. The lock, the handle, this handle, all came out of the furniture hardware bins at Home Depot. Yes. This is an aftermarket electronic speedometer, and that gets its signal from this Hall effect sensor right here. Here's the cable. I had to extend the cable by about 3 feet because that speedometer is intended to be mounted to on the front forks of an XS850 or XS650 or any of those XS series motorcycles, and of course it's coming way out back here. This Hall effect sensor reads magnets that are in the head of 3 bolts. It's a little hard to see. There's one of them right there, and as you can see, the stock bolts are socket heads. So what I did was I took the stock socket heads and I drilled them out to the diameter of the bolt so that I could slip the bolt through the resulting sleeve and then torque it down, and then the bolt would sit at the right height for the Hall effect sensor to read the bolts. There are 3 of them, 1, 2, and then another one down here. The bracket holding the center is just simply a piece of 1/4 inch aluminum plate that I shaped and formed and attached to the brake arm. So let's see. Oh, right. I'm starting to get confused. Right here are the handlebar switch pods from the XS850, mounted to, again, a piece of 19mm frame tubing from the XS850. Here we have the voltmeter and the ammeter and the tachometer. This is the tachometer from the XS850. It's a mechanical tachometer, has the neutral light and the high beam light, and it is connected to the engine through this custom-made 5-foot-long mechanical tachometer cable that goes to the stock tachometer drive, driven by the exhaust cam on the engine. The guys at Motion Pro made that for me. They're great to work with. I highly recommend them. So here's the cylinder head temperature gauge that is ordinarily connected to the middle spark plug with a big ring thermocouple, but because this engine vibrates so much, it routinely breaks the ring thermocouple, and I have to replace it. I'm not going to replace the cable this year. I'm just going to put another ring on the end of the wire. It's kind of funny though. It turns out that if I just bend it like this, so that I can jam it in between the fins, like so, it actually gets enough signal to read the temperature. Although it reads the temperature low, it doesn't read the temperature up to what I know it should be. And one other thing, this oil pressure gauge right here, it's never been hooked up, so it always reads 0. Yeah, this is the fuel pump. This is the headlamps. The headlights are Speedway Motors headlight buckets. Relatively inexpensive. They're standard hot rod items. The headlight shells, though, are a pair of Yamaha XS850 headlight buckets with LED bulbs inside them. These are, of course, the Yamaha XS850. Well, in actual fact, 3, that one, and this turn signal are all original items from the Yamaha XS850. This one right here is from some Suzuki that I found at the boneyard. As I mentioned, these seats were gifted to me by a friend who was also in a car builder and a nerdy gearhead. I don't think he'd like me calling him a nerdy gearhead, but he is. And he gave me those two seats. As you can see there, this is like the fourth set of seat covers I've put on because they do get beat up by the sun. That shift lever is from a Hurst 3-speed manual unit. He just gave it to me with the seats. Thanks, Matt. They work mint. The exhaust pipe is a handmade, this is a handmade log header. These three tubes, these three stubs right here are the original ends, the head ends of the Yamaha XS 850 exhaust, mated to some Speedway Motors sourced 1.5-inch J tubing. Making these bends was challenging. This was a challenging fabrication. Getting these curves in, carving the holes to, sweep everything in there. It works. More J tubing comes down here. Here's one holder right here. This bushing is actually a suspension bushing from a Triumph Spitfire suspension bushing. Goes down here. Here's my collector that I made. It goes from the 1.5-inch down to 2-inch. I had to add this flex coupling a couple years ago because it inline triple 120-degree crank, not counterbalanced, mounted pretty solidly in the chassis. It vibrates a lot. And what had happened was this mounting right here had initially just been 2 vertical plates welded to the pipe. And you can see this weld right here. I came out one day and I saw cracks. There were cracks back and forth from it vibrating. So it's reinforced in its little bushing, and it's got a flex joint right here to attenuate some of the vibration coming into this section of pipe. 2-inch pipe all the way back to this old Thrush glass pack that has until it got mounted on this, had followed me around for, I don't know, 25 years. I bought it for another car and just never used it. This little turn down end I made myself. It's got a baffle inside of it that I made. I think I have some pictures of it. What have I forgotten to talk about so far? Oh, the roll bar. So this roll bar right here, it is made from SCCA legal material in that it's 1.5-inch diameter DOM with a 95 wall thickness. It's SCCA legal material, but it's not SCCA legal. It would not pass an SCCA tech inspection. And the reason it is because, as you can see right here, this is slightly collapsed because I bent this tubing on an exhaust tubing bender. That's one of the main reasons. It doesn't have an angled cross brace for stiffening. And these back braces right here, they're tubing that I initially bought to make the lower control arm. So these are 1-inch by 125 wall or 1-inch by 120 wall. The gussets are 1/8 thick. Yeah, so it's mostly there so that I have a convenient handhold for pushing this thing around. Because it's got a motorcycle engine and transmission, it does not have reverse gear. So if you want to go backwards, you are either rolling down a hill or you're pushing. We're getting down to the end of this thing here, I think. Yeah, the windscreen is just a piece of 1/4-inch Lexan that I got at Home Depot. This is the second one it's had. The first one was an inch shorter. This one is a little more protective. This cowling I formed myself, and it was done really simply. I took the piece of aluminum and I held it between my arms against my chest and bent it in, bending it until it mostly matched the curvature of the cowl hoops. And then on the sides, on these corners right here, I bent it over one of the big cardboard tubes that was used to ship the material that I used for the chassis. And then it's a rattle can Rust-Oleum Royal Red. Like I said, the body takes its shape from the chassis, and you can see in these lines of rivets that you can see the shape of the structure. Each one of those lines of rivets goes along a tube. This thing doesn't see a lot of use in the rain, but so that water wouldn't get inside the tubing if I happened to get caught in the rain. And I sat on the ground outside this thing, and I had a tube of PC7 epoxy paste, and I filled each one of these rivets with PC7 over the course of an afternoon, and then painted them all silver. So yeah. I'm going to use seal rivets on the Jag Special. Yeah. So that, my friends, I think concludes this particular exposition on the three-wheeler. If you have any questions about it at all, please feel free to ask them. You can ask them in the comments. Anything that I might have forgotten, anything else that you can think of that you might want to know. Because right now, what I'm going to do is say thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you around the channel.
1, 2, 3, 4. Well, my daddy, he raced stock cars a long, long time ago at New England's fastest quarter mile, good old Westboro Road. He and Mom would rally around in their MGTD, but they bought a Porsche 356 to hear my mom and me. I was raised by gearheads, this apple fell not far from under Daddy's tillage, messing around with cars.